something that I've had to think deeply about. One of the hardest points I think for me in terms of the weight of the claim, and maybe we can get into this a little bit, is ideas of apostolic succession or kind of the episcopacy in general. Um, I well, first to level set, you would say apostolic succession proper is an accretion.
I would.
Okay.
Yep, proper.
Proper.
So
Maybe I'll let you make that distinction.
yeah, so we all believe the church succeeds from the apostolic era to the post-apostolic era. And the ministry of the church succeeds from point A to point B. But apostolic succession in its proper definition, and I'm tempted to grab the book so I make sure I get this right.
You can.
It's like a quote from it, because I have a chapter on apostolic succession in the book. And so, but it involves a number of actually incredibly specific claims. Now the phrase is used differently by different people. So, in the broad idea, apostolic succession just means a continuous chain of bishops leading back to the apostles. But usually, and you said proper, so in its technical meaning, it usually involves what amounts to a very restrictivist kind of claim, or let's say restrictive or exclusivist kind of claim about the nature of sacraments, the nature of valid ministry, the nature of ordination. So, you've got the office of bishop is a distinct office from presbyter by apostolic appointment, not by a church custom or development or decision. But that has divine backing to it, that distinction. So you got 3 offices in the church. That's what the church that God set up. And then you go bishop to bishop through the laying on of hands. And apart from that lineal succession, there is ordinarily no valid ministry and thus no valid sacraments. Lots of wrinkles we could get into in terms of possible exceptions and so forth. But to me, that is a fairly restrictive and mechanical view of valid sacraments. Right. And I do see that as an accretion. I see, I in the book, I try to just chart it out. Here's what Ignatius means by the word bishop. Here's the first century data. Here's the second century data. Here's what Ignatius says. Here's what Irenaeus says. Later in the second century, here's the testimony of Jerome. Here's the apostolic constitutions. And you're trying to piece it all together and look. And it certainly looks like this thing that's kind of, the pieces are gradually coalescing and coming together. And I won't try to remember all the scholarship I cite in the book on this, but I'll say that that's a common interpretation, even among scholars who hold to traditions that believe in a very full-throated apostolic succession.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think the thing that makes it interesting to me is that it does seem like, compared to something like, we'll talk about Mary's Assumption or icons in a second, that the threefold office and a kind of centralization of power to the bishops and an idea of the bishops having their authority through their connection to the apostles happens relatively quickly.
Yes.
And so I suppose we could still use accretion for that, but I think the draw of the claim is a bit stronger in that it didn't take long for them to start moving in this direction in terms of church government. Would you agree with that generally?
Well, I would make a distinction between what you see quickly versus apostolic succession.
Okay.
So you get bishops quickly. But this is why I said, what does Ignatius mean by bishop? Right. He does not have diocesan bishops. He has congregational bishops. They're just like kind of similar to what would be like the pastor of a local church today. That's usually granted in the scholarship on Ignatius. He doesn't have apostolic succession. Ignatius does not think bishops are the successors of the apostles. He thinks the presbyters are. These presbyters, in his letters, he says, are standing in the seat of the apostles. So this is what we mean by an accretion, is what Ignatius says is, not how we've defined apostolic succession. What Irenaeus says 60 years later, a little more, is, he's still at that time speaking of presbyters as the successors of the apostles, which is a little eccentricity of language. You're wondering, well, why does he say that? And it's, again, because of this accreted reality of it's kind of slowly emerging. So what you have is a tightening and crystallizing, I would say, in the 3rd and 4th century with respect to how the transmission of spiritual grace through this office is understood, and it's kind of mechanicalized in a way. Now people are going to say, oh, so you're saying that, the church's understanding of this fell into total error in these times. No, not necessarily. I mean, the church's government has to evolve in some ways. Anywhere you look, you're going to see these constant developments. Where do you get archdeacons first? Where do you get archbishops first, and so forth? All these offices are kind of developing, and that's all fine. We're not saying it's all bad. We're just trying to be accurate and trace it out. And but yeah, I mean, so bishops come early, but apostolic succession proper, I think the general view of scholarship is it's more 3rd, 4th century, honestly, 4th, more before you really see a tightening around it.
Yeah, and I can already picture the comments about scholarship generally, but I'll just for the
yeah.
record, I'm very scholarship friendly, so I'm not going
Thank
to
you.
press you on that point. I think we'd all do well to
Let's just let them give it to us in the comments and attack us on that point.
Yeah. I think maybe one important thing here, though, and I actually don't know your full view on this, would be, so we have a development of church government here. We have developments of other doctrines, though, that are seated in the New Testament that we're getting more clarity on as time goes on. I think you would agree with that. So, like, say, the Chalcedonian definition there, you would probably say all of the material is in the New Testament, but you're not going to find maybe it spelled out that rigorously at that point. So there's a solidification of how we express Christ to his natures there. But with the role of the bishop and kind of the threefold office and how that develops and the authority given to him, you would say that there's not sufficient scriptural data to merit that being the authoritative way to govern the church. Is that right? Because I'm trying to think.
The authority, yes. Yeah, I would say that. I would say, yeah, exactly. So, Richard Hooker has a kind of mediated view on this in the Anglican tradition where he says, it's not strictly necessary, but it is proper and good, and makes all kinds of arguments for the episcopate. But then he says it lacks jure divino, a Latin phrase meaning it's not by divine right. Mm-hmm. And basically, I just make a distinction between offices in the church that are valid, but not strictly necessary, versus offices in the church that are necessary. And I would just put the development of the episcopate in the first of those two categories. It makes great prudential sense to have one of the presbyters kind of put up into this particular role. And this, from a pragmatic standpoint, you can see all kinds of benefits for that. But the question is, because, again, this is why we define apostolic succession carefully.
Right.
They're saying distinction between presbyter and bishop is apostolic. That distinction is of divine constitution.
Right.
Okay, so that's the issue, and my position would be that it looks to me like it's just something that's coming along the way, and I actually think even in the the scholar, I try to reference the scholarship again here. Oh boy, maybe I should say something about that. Yeah, we should take a sip every time we mention the scholarship. I guess I could talk about the scholarship if that would help anybody. I don't know, but
let's do it. I mean, do you want to?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. Well, just say, I understand. I think any posture towards references to scholarship in general, whether good or bad, is not going to be a wise posture for us. I think we really always will need to get specific in terms of how is scholarship being used. Right. No one can just reject all scholarship. No one can accept all scholarship. And while it's true that there's often a liberal or secular bias in much of scholarship, when the claim on the table isn't one that's necessarily or clearly affected by that kind of bias, I think we will need some reason if we are going to be skeptical of a scholarly claim. So I've given the example before of the dating of the book of Daniel. I go against the scholarly majority view. I hold to an earlier date of the book of Daniel. And the reason is, I think there's a sort of skeptical bias involved in that dating because people don't believe in future predictive prophecy. And that's why they date it. That's one of the reasons why they date it later. And I think, well, I do believe in future predictive prophecy, so I don't have any reason to go with that. But if it's just something where it's like scholars are just sort of searching out the texts and trying to trace out, like, when does icon veneration start? I'm not aware, especially if these scholars are in many cases devout Christians, not necessarily Protestants either. I just wouldn't know why we would be skeptical of those claims. I mean, someone would need a reason to say, why is it wrong to let the scholarship help us on this? These scholars are just basically helping us, number one, figure out what are doing text critical work. What are the texts that actually are from the times and not later interpolations into the texts? That's a work of scholarship that's really important, So whenever people say, read the primary sources, don't read the scholarship, I say we need the scholarship to know what the primary sources are. But I would agree that we shouldn't read scholarship uncritically. We certainly need to critically evaluate what it is saying. That was an aside. I can't remember what we were talking about before.
No, we were talking about apostolic succession, and I think it's important that we kind of went around this for a bit, because I think when someone hears you say apostolic succession is an accretion, they might say, wait, but we've got all these pieces so early. And I think getting into it seems to me like one of the real issues is how restrictive apostolic succession proper is.
Right.
Instead of saying that, oh, like a threefold office and, tracing the lineage of the church through a line of bishops, like that's a good way of organizing the church. It's functional. It works. We could do that. There's a difference between saying that and saying this is of apostolic origin by divine constitution, and therefore, absent of this, you are not a church. They seem like very different claims, and so I think that's what we've distinguished here. Is that fair to say?
Yes, and hopefully this will be not lost upon our viewers. What the very important points you just made is that, yes, that's why we define apostolic succession. Apostolic succession is the reason why the Roman Catholics said that the Anglicans don't have a valid Eucharist back whenever that dispute happened. Well, the Anglicans have bishops, but the problem was a chink in the armor. So I wouldn't, with respect to apostolic succession, I wouldn't say we have pieces early. Actually, the idea of bishop to bishop, necessity of laying on of hands for valid ministry, that's, that I don't see that early. I would say that would be unrecognizable, not only to the apostles, but to an Ignatius or an Irenaeus.
What do you make of like Clement's points about the apostles when they came to the end of their life saw it necessary to appoint successor? Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Clement? Yeah.
I put it out a short on this once.
Oh, did you? Okay.
So people could look it up. I was like, it's always the great challenge of, is this worth a video or can I squeeze it down to 60 seconds?
Yeah. Or can we fit it into a 2-hour video?
yeah, exactly. I mean, so that passage is, I don't think that's a good interpretation of the passage if someone is trying to say to get apostolic succession out of that, because we all agree the apostles appointed offices in the church. The question is which ones and how do they function? But Clement says there's two. And he even quotes Old Testament scripture to establish the two offices of the church. So, and that I deal with him in the book, maybe 4 of the passages in his first epistle, where basically, from Clement's standpoint, there are 2 offices in the church. They are, and the higher office of leadership is a plurality. And I think that's how he paints the leadership of the church in Corinth. And I think that's reflected in Rome at that time as well. And I think there's also corroborating testimony for that with respect to Rome in the Shepherd of Hermas, where you've got plurality of presbyters in the leadership. I think you see that in other cities as well, like in Polycarp's letter to the Philippians and a few other points of data. I think you see it in the Didache, also in the first century. And then I think it is just resounding in the New Testament as well. So Clement doesn't say anything about 3 offices. In other words, I think Clement's a testimony for a 2-office view.
Right. Would it be possible that it's testimony for a 2-office view? So it doesn't give the 3-office, but does it give the necessity of the succession part of that? Because that seems to be the point in question that he's initially addressing, right? Like in the context is they saw fit to appoint successors to their ministry because they're getting later in age, right? Like if
that's a point we would all agree on.
Yeah. Okay.
That it was necessary for the apostles to appoint offices in the church to provide leadership. Again, I said we all agree that the apostolic to post-apostolic, there's a succession of the ministry of the church. We all agree in certain offices. The question is how many, which ones, what is their function, and so forth. We could pull up the passage if you want. I don't recall anything in terms of necessity, in terms of like, where he gets granular on that at all.
I don't think he does. No, I don't think it's like or else you don't have a valid Eucharist kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Um,
But Protestants would just agree. Absolutely, the apostles set up offices.
Yeah.
No doubt about it. The question is which ones, and we would say, I would say, you know, not never want to be triumphalist. I need to. Sometimes I read my book and I'm like, ooh, hope I didn't push it too strong there, because you're typing at your computer and you're in one mind, you're just thinking logically. You don't want to step on people's toes. But I need to say this because in case it. To meet the strength of the charges against us, I think the evidence is unanimous from the time in question and then corroborated from later testimonies like Jerome. I think every shred of evidence from the first century supports that the office of bishop and presbyter during the apostolic age were interchangeable. I think that is I do not know how anybody can't get that out of Titus 1, that passage alone, where the qualification list is clearly parallel to 1 Timothy 3, and the words are used interchangeably for the office. And then you look, plurality of leadership everywhere in each of the local churches in Acts, same in 1st Epistle of Clement, same in the Didache, 2 offices. So, and then we've got Jerome telling us, I mean, if people don't like my idea of an accretion, okay, Jerome doesn't use the word accretion, but that's exactly what he says happens. It's in his language, the custom of the church, not the tradition of the apostles. It's something that arose in response to a certain occasion of schism, and the church decides to do this, but it's developing. That's what Jerome tells us happens. To me, just looking at it, from sort of a historical angle, it looks like this is just pretty clearly what happened. You got it in the original text, you got it in the later. And I think where people get tripped up is they look at Ignatius and the importance of the bishop and Ignatius and that kind of thing, and that's where we just try to be accurate and kind of tracing out what is happening and when it's happening. The strength of the position against us, I think, is but look how early bishops come in, and that's totally fair point. The question is, what does the word bishop mean? Because, again, for Ignatius, the bishop is not the successor of the apostle. He's not diocesan. There's all these differences, and that's where, as Protestants, we would just look at all this and say, fine, the Lord Jesus is building his church. It's developing, it's changing, and all that. But you don't have to have these particular structures that accrue over time.
I want to get into one more point on this before we get into the other specifics that I've been promising for a while. But I think this is fruitful, and I think
people can look in the timestamps for bodily assumption of Mary in the timestamps. It'll come later.
Yeah, it'll be there eventually.
Or
it'll be there, and it'll get clipped out.
Yeah.
But one other way that I've seen Catholic scholars kind of approach some of these questions, specifically on doctrines that I think you have even later attestation. I'm thinking of like Matthew Levering on the bodily assumption. There we go, bodily assumption. We're there. There seems to be this move to look at or assert a certain divine guidance of history in the development of these things. So you might see something like, okay, maybe there's this development of how the twofold office went to 3 and how succession was meted out and all of these things, but then we've just had it for a really long time. And I think there's people that are looking at this and saying, whether at a popular level or kind of more scholarly level, and asking, well, ought we to trust that God is guiding his church in this? And so far in this conversation, we've made a real distinction between apostolic and post-apostolic. That if it's from the apostolic period, then we can kind of use that for development. But if it's not, we're looking at something a little bit different. We're in the realm of accretion. And it seems like some people, I guess, might not grant that point and want to see something more like God being active in the history of the church. Are you tracking with me here?
Yeah. And I would certainly agree. God is. We could overemphasize the distinction from apostolic to post-apostolic. So we'll all agree on a pretty qualitative distinction there. I mean, the Catholics will use the distinction of public versus private revelation to try to demarcate. There's something that changes as the apostles die. There's no more New Testament being written. You're off into a new era right now. We could overemphasize that difference, though, because as Protestants, we certainly agree God is at work. There is divine guidance to the church. And in fact, most historic Protestant traditions have affirmed the indefectibility of the church. That means the church shall never die or fail to achieve her end. And Protestants were unanimous to a T, saying the church never died. No matter how bad things have ever been, the church has never died. Christ is on the throne. He's guiding his church. So divine guidance in church history, absolutely. I think where we make the distinction is where what we see is absolutely definitional and necessary to Christianity. And two, to get more specific, ecclesial reality with valid sacraments and salvation. And so we would just say there's a lot that can come to obtain and accrue within the church, even for long periods of time, and play a significant role within the church while not being strictly necessary to the church. An example, Roman emperors. After the conversion of Constantine, the Roman Empire plays a really significant role in the church. The Roman emperor is called the co-ruler of the church alongside God. Every single one of the first 7 ecumenical councils is both convoked and presided over by a Roman emperor. We can't even imagine how the church would be different today if you didn't have the Roman Empire, right? But the Roman Empire goes away and the church keeps rumbling forward. So that's an example of something being extremely significant in the development and a part of how God's providence, and yet not essential to the church. So we would say today where a church springs up, let's say in a third world country, they hear the gospel and they are through the internet. There's no human contact, but through the internet they hear the gospel. They respond to the gospel. They are reciting the Apostles' Creed on Sunday mornings. People have gotten saved. They are baptized. They're taking the Lord's Supper. The demons are cast out. The witch doctors lose their powers and are converted. There's dramatic overturning from idolatry to worship of the Trinity. There's all the spiritual fruits you would expect. And they're taking the Lord's Supper. They're getting baptized. They're hearing the Word of God. We would say this is a church. And the fact that you don't have a Roman emperor around, who cares? It's not essential. And I would say the same thing for whether you have a distinction between the office of bishop and presbyter. Yes, that distinction came to be normal and remains so for huge fathoms of time, but that doesn't mean it's necessary. So we are not saying you can't do that. What we're saying is you don't make it necessary such that, oh, that's not actually a valid Eucharist over there among these people in this village because they didn't have a bishop lay hands on another bishop. And some more ecumenical Catholics or something or others might try to parse out the situation in the village differently from others. But look at what the Catholics said about the Anglican Eucharist. It is still pretty restrictive. So that's the concern. I think it gets misframed at the popular level sometimes. People are acting like we're against the idea that a bishop emerged. It's like, that's fine. What we're trying to do is push against the restrictiveness that comes to be seen as essential to the church, essential of divine constitution.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed this clip. If you did, you'll probably enjoy the full interview too, which you can find here. And if you haven't already, you should consider subscribing, which you can do here. Lastly, if you are bought into the vision of gospel simplicity, which is bringing simplicity out of theological and historical complexity, you can support the channel by going to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity or clicking on the link in the description down below. Thanks, and God bless.